Are you struggling at the moment in your relationship with the owners that your company is building for? If so, this interview in today's episode of Construction Genius is for you. My guest is Antonia Botero. She is the owner of MADDPROJECT, a project management and business consulting firm. She believes in the power of applying strategic project planning and data-driven decision-making to all construction projects, regardless of scope. She has deep experience working in some of the most challenging project environments in the world. And she has come to develop a process and an approach to managing projects that is based on strong teams, strong contracts, clear data, and transparency. We take a deep dive into each one of these aspects of project management and discuss how they relate together and help contractors, owners' reps, and the owners work as a team so that a project can be executed successfully and profitably. So if you'd like to get some insights into the owner's perspective, this episode of Construction Genius is going to be super helpful. So check it out all the way to the end. At the end, Antonia shares 3 insights that every construction company needs to lay hold of in order to build successfully. I know you're going to find this interview super helpful. Thank you for listening to Construction Genius today, and feel free to share this interview with anyone else that you think would benefit from listening to it. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Antonia, welcome to Construction Genius.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I've been wanting to get you on the show because you are on the owner's side of the table. So in today's discussion, we want to take a deep dive into the things that you see from the owner's side with contractors that impact a construction project.
Sure.
There's this famous concept, we're all familiar with it. It's kind of related to entropy, where a project starts out well-ordered, everyone's got the best intentions, and then things, as time progresses, it goes to disorder and then eventually to chaos.
Right.
Many contractors seem to be comfortable in that window between disorder and chaos. In your experience, what are the most effective ways to fight against that cycle and to keep a project in order?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree that it's a very common thing and that you see often. And I also agree with that. It doesn't need to be that way. Mm-hmm. I think a big one too, that everyone sort of forgets and kind of leaves behind, it is really the idea that ultimately the leader of the project is the owner, is the developer. And so when you have a developer who knows and has done, several projects before, they are going to know that if they're not holding people accountable and they're not saying like, hey, we need to have a weekly meeting. Hey, we need to review the budget once a week. Hey, we need to go through the change order log. It's at some point, who else is accountable if it's not the project owner, right? Like they're the largest stakeholder. They're probably, handing over the largest portion of their interest in this project over to this contractor. And if they're not kind of setting the expectation to say, hey, we need to meet regularly, we need to keep an eye on things, then you're right. Like the contractor sometimes can get into the details, into the weeds and sort of forget the big picture. And if no one's kind of reeling them back in, for sure that can happen. So this one in my mind is always like, the owner is not watching it, and the owner should be able to reel them back in and to say, hey guys, like we need to keep our weekly meetings. We need to have, the weekly walks or the monthly walks or however, it's scheduled. We need to look at the overall schedule, look at the budget, change order log, submittal log, like what questions are outstanding. And if you're not having these conversations, you're not watching the job. So, in my mind, it's like the owner has a lot of responsibility on this for sure.
It's interesting. What experience or how often do you come across owners who are, they're just wanting to push everything off of their plate? They want to get a project done. They want to get it built, but they're figuring if I can just bring in the right people, they can take care of all that hassle and I won't have to worry about it.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think a portion of our work, I would say like half of the work that we do are very experienced owners who don't have the resources in-house and they're not interested in building an owner's rep or a construction team in-house.
Right.
And so they hire us for it. And I think that if that's kind of your approach and you're very clear on what the expectations are to say like, hey, I'm hiring you so that I don't have to deal with these things. I think that's a really good setup. I think that that's a very smart thing to do. If you don't have the resources or the wherewithal, or you've never done it before, that's a kind of a different kind of client that we have. Sort of newer developers who are like, we're not really sure how to do this. We're not sure what the standards are. Can you guys come in? So yeah, I mean, I think the people who are the most wanting to not do the work themselves are usually clients who are very experienced, who just know that they don't have the resources to do it in-house, but they know that they need to watch the job. And so that's where I see it most.
Excellent. So as the owner's rep, you sit between the contractors and the owner. What do contractors get wrong most about owners?
I think there's almost this, and I guess it varies. It's a difficult thing to generalize, right? But yeah. I think the biggest sort of misconception, particularly for owners that are very meticulous and who really want to see the books and get the full transparency, I think a lot of contractors get the sense that the owner is like out to get them. And I really think that kind of putting yourself in their shoes, kind of being the contractor, putting yourself in the owner's shoes to think, hey, you're about to hand over your majority stake in this project to somebody that potentially you've never worked with before. Which, hopefully you've vetted them and you've interviewed them and you check their financials and it all works, but put yourself in their shoes. And at the end of the day, especially when you have owners that are experienced, they're typically people that want to create a really good partnership so that if there's any issues, they can help. Right. And so that's where the transparency comes in, and it's less about I'm gonna get you, and more about let's all know what's going on with the project so that should a problem arise, like we can all help. And I think that that's a big one that you see across like contract negotiations. You see it across change order negotiations, like any moment in the project where there's kind of like a high stress. You sort of get this perception that the contractor, and again, not all contractors, some contractors that I've worked with are very happy to be completely transparent because they understand that if they are and that we're all on the same page, then we can row in the same direction. So I think that that's a big one that contractors get wrong from owners. It's less about, and I'm again, not to say that there's owners that are not trying to get you, right? Yeah. Like we've all worked with terrible people at some point in our careers. But I don't think that that's the majority.
You use the word transparency, and I know that's one of the things that you really focus on in your work. Yeah. It's interesting. I've had so many conversations with my clients where, we talk about the dynamic with their owners. They're having a challenge, and they say a lot of times, we want to be transparent up to a point, but perhaps not fully transparent because we don't want them to see how we're making the sausage here. So, what do you mean by transparency?
Well, I mean, I think that there's some types of projects, again, it all needs to be project specific and it needs to be appropriate, right? So if you're doing like a small residential renovation and your schedule is 6 weeks, the level of detail that I would expect to see on a job like that is much lesser than that of like, let's say $100 million ground up project, right? Just because you literally don't have the time. But again, I think it's really that expectation of rowing in the same direction, right? And for me, it comes down to, I've seen contractors try to mark up like Home Depot tile 300%. And I'm like, well, why don't I just go buy this myself? And then I can bring it onto the job site and then you can put it in and you don't have to fight about this. And it's sort of like, I don't think there's anything wrong. I think there's also that kind of thought that you think the other person on the side of the table doesn't want you to make money. And this is something that I tell owners and contractors all the time, especially when we're negotiating contracts, is like, if the contractor's not making any money, I don't want to work with them. Like, I hate it when people come and they say, well, I'm not even making any more money on this job. And I'm like, if you go under, it's all bad for all of us. So like, if you need help, we need to know, but in order to know, we need to fully understand like the magnitude of a problem and the transparency there. Typically for those big jobs, you would expect to see, or I always put in for it always starts out as a cost plus agreement that then turns into a GMP, and it's fully open book. And part of that, that conversation is really having clear fee, clear markup, and saying like, your subcontractors cannot charge more than 15% on change orders. Like, they can't. And you have that conversation on day one. Right. And so we're both on the same page. And that's what I mean by transparency. I think sitting across the table from someone and saying like, hey, how much do you make? How much are you making on the material here? Is a really straightforward answer. Like, I want you to make money on the material. I don't think that I want you to make 300% on Home Depot tile. So that's kind of really what I go to more than anything. It's the transparency and the understanding of the expectations, and all of us being clear to say, by the same token, the contractor should be able to say, hey, look, like, I need to mark it up 20% or whatever, because procuring this material requires all of this extra work from my people. And so I need to make it work. And that's reasonable. And I think that people are just so scared of having like the money conversations, but at the same time, you're sitting at the table having these massive money conversations without discussing the details.
So it's interesting there, because in this talk about transparency, you bring in this idea of the contracts that you like to operate under. Yeah. What is the impact of a strong contract on the ability of all parties involved in a project to be transparent with each other? Yeah,
I mean, that's a great question. And that's why my team relies so much on strong contracts, because for me, the number one aspect of a strong contract is that everybody involved in it knows what it says. That's sort of something that people kind of miss. Like, they'll just rush through like all of the key points and they say, okay, we agree, and then they sign, and then nobody remembers. I think setting those expectations and like the obligations and the liabilities early on, being upfront about them, is and sort of all walking in together saying like, okay, this is how much you think is fair to charge for this project. This is how much I think it's fair to charge for this project. These are the things that we expect you to do. When you walk in with a strong contract like that, like, the whole team is already on day one going to be on the same page.
Right.
So that's really why it's such an important part of a project.
And why is it that you choose GNP as a contract vehicle? Why is that something that you've found to be effective?
Well, I think also, and there's so much, I think, misconceptions about legally how a GMP works. Where a lot of people, some people say, oh, GMP, you're just waiting to get change orders to death. And there's like all that kind of stuff. So I kind of won't go too much into the weeds of the misconceptions of a GMP. Yeah. I like a GMP because, again, it's a really great way to set very clear expectations on the project. Right. And it also sets it up so that it's an open book like model. And again, that comes with a lot of conversations and discussions about what are going to be the markups and what are going to be the things that you're going to allow your subcontracts to say. And I think that can make a big difference. What I really like about the GMP too is that it kind of forces that consensus and that and those conversations to the earlier parts of a project where you shake hands and you say, okay, like, this bid is good for 30 days. If we sign within 30 days, we lock in this price. And obviously we're seeing all the crazy stuff in the supply chain right now, and there's some volatility there. Yeah. But I think overall, as a standard, forcing to have those conversations earlier on is really, for me, what ends up yielding much more successful projects at the end of the day.
Okay, so let's talk about that. As the owner's rep, then, are you running that initial project kickoff meeting? Or is that what you do?
Yeah. So typically, I mean, we're a little bit unique in that we don't just do construction. We basically oversee the projects from the beginning, from feasibility. Sometimes
Right.
people haven't even bought land. And so we're involved through the whole design process. And in a lot of instances, we are directly involved with design decisions that are appropriate for the product type, the asset class, the market, all that stuff. And so we're very familiar with the project by the time we get to the beginning of a contract. And so, and then we're also very, very familiar with, the different types of contracts, contract negotiation. And so we're really involved, as much as an owner would like us to be involved, we are involved.
Right.
So often, yes, we are the ones leading those kickoff meetings and a lot of the negotiations, we're very intimately a part of.
So let me ask you about that kickoff meeting then. As if you're leading it, what is your number one goal in that meeting?
I think, again, to get through the major points and to find consensus, right? There's a lot of empathy that goes into negotiation. There's a lot of putting yourself in the other person's shoes and really understanding where they're coming from in a negotiation. And you got to take into account like the current market, the market where your project is being built, the lending environment that we're in right now, the capital environment that we're in. And so having all this context is super important, because sometimes like an owner, like we were just saying, an owner will have the owner's perspective only, or the contractor will have the contractor's perspective only. And so being sort of in the middle and saying, sometimes there's some refereeing going on, and sometimes there's telling the owner like, no, that's actually market for this moment, and it's an adequate thing to agree to. And so really it's kind of moving the ball forward and really understanding that we're addressing the major concerns for everyone, because the whole point is to walk out of there with comfortable terms where people are able to comply with them.
How do you, because you're kind of in the middle, right? You got your contractors on the left, the owner on the right,
Sure.
You're in the middle. When you're in one of those kickoff meetings and a point of conflict comes up, and it seems many times in meetings, there's the wave of conflict comes up, and then it begins to recede because people either back off or they just don't want to handle it then. Yeah. What do you do to make sure that things don't get swept under the rug at the beginning, which are going to come back to bite you later on in the project?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a big one too, of like leading meetings, and kind of having that strong relationship with the owner, who's like ultimately the person that I work with, is to say, towards the end of the meeting, is like, okay, so who is sending the email? Like, who is going to do this next step? And I think that's really an important part of every meeting, right? Like you want to say, okay, we got here, we agree to this, so who's doing what now? And I always bring it back to them, and it's sort of awkward sometimes, like, like you said, some people just kind of give up on it, and they're like, oh, we're not going to fight about this. I'm not going to fight about this anymore. And so you're kind of reeling everyone back in. So it's twofold, right? Like one of the purposes is to kind of bring the team back together and say, hey guys, okay, like we're a team, we're going to move forward. And then number two is the actual action item, right? Where you say, okay, well, you send the email, you go back to your corner, like I'll make the phone call and we'll touch base tomorrow.
Interesting, because every project varies, but some projects are so tremendously complex, and yet the mechanism for getting a project built from the people side of the equation is in many ways incredibly straightforward if you're willing to have those tough conversations. For
sure. And I think a big one, like it comes also down to the whole transparency thing. Recently, I was doing a negotiation where we had a time period after which the contractor would waive claims if they did not let the owner know about a delay or a change order. And they kept fighting. They were like, well, we're not going to waive any claims. And I'm like, well, like if you're not telling me that you're going to have a delay in a timely manner, you can't come back 6 months later and say, hey, by the way, that thing we did 6 months ago, yeah, that now we have a delay because of it.
Right.
And I'm like, why would you even want to have that as a possibility? Like, like it's in your interest and in the whole project's interest for you to like be communicative and say, hey, we have a problem, and it's either a change order or it's a delay or whatever, and to let us know as soon as possible. Like, in what kind of circumstance would you not be okay with that? And so it's, that kind of has made me really think of that, where it's the communication and the urgency to sort of, again, going back to the idea of team. Like, we're all a team, we're going in the same direction. Like, we shouldn't be having to hide things from each other.
Right.
Like, there's no need. It just doesn't, it doesn't help anybody at the end of the day.
It's interesting because, again, going back to the contract is this relatively objective
Right.
framework that then you can build the transparency and the team off of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, the process of doing a contract negotiation really allows you to set up a lot of your expectations, not like the objective ones that are on paper, but also the subjective ones where you're reasonable, where you're empathetic, where you're holding people to task, where you end that negotiation saying, like, okay, well, you guys are going to put the comments together, we're going to review them. And it kind of sets up the dynamic of how we're going to work from then on. So that's also a big part of it.
So let's talk about that. The best projects, they have a consistent meeting rhythm to them.
Yeah.
In your mind, how would you describe the best meeting rhythm for a successful project? What does that look like?
Yeah. So you meet once a week on site. And if you have teams that are off site, you got to get on a call once a week, regardless. Even if it's to say, hey guys, there's nothing going on, we're good. Even if it's just to say that, you keep the meeting, it lives on the calendar. And then ideally in those meetings, you go through your 2-week look ahead, which should have 1 week prior. You go through your change order log, your submittal log, and you go through your budget. And additionally, you also go through the overall schedule in terms of milestones, obviously not in full detail, because that's what the 2-week look ahead's for. And then you have a bank walk that is typically once a month. And if you don't have that requirement because the project is not large enough, or you don't have a lender or whatever, you should still have, sort of a little bit of a bigger team walking the site once a month. Ideally, you have your architect doing observation reports once a month, and either you can group that together or not. But I think, and then obviously making sure that you're reviewing the observation reports is a big one. And generally, those observation reports will include any inspection reports that have happened in the month leading up to it. So for me, that's kind of the standard rhythm of the project. Things that you absolutely have to have as an owner, that you need to hold everyone to keep that smooth flow, and also to keep that, to facilitate the transparency too, right? Because if you're seeing my face once a week and I'm saying like, hey, what's going on? And I can see that you're like uneasy, or like, you're like, well, there's this thing, but it's not really a thing. And I could be like, come on, Eric, like, let's just tell me. And then we're able to, go on, and then I can help, right? Because if I don't know the problem, I can't help. So
how do you manage owners who tend to micromanage too much and get too involved in a project? How do you handle them and sort of tell them, hey, back off and just let the contractors do the work?
Yeah, I tell them. I mean, not in front of people. I'll usually have a terrible meeting and they're doing like all kinds of crazy things or sending all kinds of crazy emails. Like, I will be like, hey, look, I'm like, and I think also building those relationships with everybody else on the project, where they feel like they're comfortable coming to me to say like, hey, can you please tell the owner to like relax a little bit, because this is inappropriate, or this sort of opens us up for liability or whatever. Then I do spend a lot of time, especially newer owners, newer developers. I basically spend a lot of time kind of walking them through industry standards and expectations and general, the chain of command in a job. And sometimes people just don't know. And when you explain it and you explain the liabilities that go around those things, generally they're good. Once and again, you gotta meet them where they are, and you gotta be empathetic, right? Like, you gotta say, hey, look, I totally get what you're saying, and I totally get where you're coming from. And yes, that light fixture has not been delivered and it's been 2 months, but you can't send emails like that.
Yeah. That's interesting. So with the strong contracts and the reporting, you've got to get good, clean data as much as possible.
Yeah.
That's one of the deep challenges that, contractors often have is that whole process of reporting.
Yeah.
What do the best contractors do in terms of gathering and communicating data that the other contractors don't do?
I think that gathering it and communicating it's really pretty straightforward. I think that where, again, it goes back to the owner in my mind more than the contractor, because the owner should be keeping them accountable, right? Like when we signed this contract, we expected you to do, to have a pay application process that has this many days for pencil rec, and you're supposed to issue it in the G702, G703 format. If it comes to the 25th of the month and you haven't issued the thing, the owner should be like, hey, do you want to get paid? Like, we need this document and it needs to be in this format. And then going back and actually reviewing the numbers and ensuring that, your current pay application jives with your last pay application. And then additionally, I always tell owners that, and we run all of our projects this way, we keep our own anticipated cost reports. Because, we're not only tracking the contractor, we're also tracking the consultants through construction. Because this is bank draw information that you're going to need, and it needs to be clean, and it needs to be sometimes in a very specific format. So, I always tell owners, like, you cannot rely on the contractor's data. Again, 90% of the time, it's not because I think that the contractor is doing some financial engineering in the back and trying to like fleece anyone. I just think that it's so much data that you have a high probability for making a mistake. And so, it's really on the owner to keep an anticipated cost report. And if they're not keeping one, then at minimum to be thoroughly reviewing those pay applications and also holding the contractor to, to the standards set forth in the contract that are, in many instances, industry standards, and clear expectations that, hey, like, you need to bill your change orders at the end of the month. If we approved it this month, it has to go in this pay app. And if it's not in this pay app, like, why isn't it in the pay app? And did you forget it? Or, it's really kind of back on the owner. On the contractor side, it's just really having the adequate team to do it.
Right.
Some smaller shops try to kind of have like the super updating the anticipated cost report and the G702, G703. And like, the guy literally has no time. He like doesn't have a computer on site. Like, it's just, you have to be realistic about your team and their capabilities. And if it's something that you're lacking, then it should be like and at the end of the day, honestly, like, it benefits contractors to have strong teams that are able to put together good accounting, because that's how you get paid.
Right.
Like, that's how you get paid on time, and that's how you get paid the right amount. So, I always kind of encourage people to not forget that piece.
When you're working with a contractor, you've used the word empathy quite a bit, and I think empathy is not necessarily a word that a lot of people use in construction many times, because it tends to be adversarial. And how do you, when you're working with a contractor specifically, how do you help them to see things from the owner's perspective? What can you think of a conversation you've had where you're talking to a contractor and then all of a sudden a light bulb went off in their mind and they began to understand what you were saying about the owner's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it always comes down, and this is a big one too, whenever there's like any substantial completion conversations, like substantial completion language conversations or in a negotiation, usually, I don't know if it's like a construction contractor council, not construction owner council, but contractor council, that has this sort of reaction to taking out lender requirements from the language. And I'm like, if you don't meet the lender requirements, you're not getting paid, whether it's in your contract or not. And honestly, the owner can't do anything about it. So you're actually, put yourself in the shoes of the owner, that you're beholden to this lender. You have to do what they say. There's no, at the end of the day, they're the boss. And so, put yourself in the shoes of the owner to know that there's this other governing body on this project that we all have to, listen to. And I think that, to me, that's one of the easier ones, where they're very quickly like, oh yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess the owner has to put this in here, because otherwise nobody's getting paid.
Right.
That's one that happens over and over again.
Huh.
Lender requirements is just a big one. And I think the other one too is sometimes like in terms of, and this is more when you have sort of boutique or luxury work where the owner changes their mind several times.
Yes.
And it's not, like the contractor's like, well, why am I ripping out this tile for the fourth time? Like, why are we putting in yet a different tile in here?
Yep.
And, a lot of those conversations are like, hey, look, there was this marketing study that the owner did, and you kind of explain to them the situation a little bit. And it goes a little bit of a ways. Sometimes like, they're just annoyed and there's really nothing you can do about it.
Right.
And in those moments, you can just say, you know what, I totally get it that you're annoyed and that there's nothing that I can do about it. But there's also nothing that I can do about the fact that we got to do the work.
Yeah.
So, it's just really kind of like giving them like a glimpse of the owner's thought process sometimes helps a lot, because a lot of times you don't realize that, a lot of these owners, they're in many instances under tremendous stress. They have these massive loans. They additionally very likely have investors or capital coming from outside. And there's all these demands, right? Like there's all these things that sometimes contractors don't realize that exist. And likewise, in the other direction, the owners don't realize that the contractors have all of these relationships and obligations on their end. And so kind of saying like, I get it, your tile guy is ready to kill you. We'll make sure that you get the change order in there. We'll make sure you guys get paid, and kind of reassuring them and giving them a little bit of a glimpse helps a lot. And I think it just makes people feel less like, oh, they're just making me do this to make me do it.
Right.
Which nobody likes to work under those conditions.
So I made a note here. This idea of educating the contractors helps them to come to a point of empathy, perhaps.
Absolutely. And it works both ways too. Same thing with the owner.
Yep.
Yeah.
What do you think are the main things that owners miss about contractors? What's the main complaint you hear from owners where you're like, dude, you just need to stop. Let me explain to you how it really is.
I think that's an interesting one. I think in the current volatility for the supply chain and a lot of the material market that we're seeing right now, some owners just won't hear that the price is the price. And,
yeah.
And that's after, for me, like we put a CM typically through an extensive descoping process before we buy. So I'm not one to say, oh, I see the price, and if it looks okay, then we just sign. Like that's not at all it. But in many instances, you'll go through like 5 or 6 rounds of descoping. You'll meet with like 4 or 5 subs for a certain trade, and the owner will still say like, oh no, I'm gonna call so and so, and I'm gonna bring them in, and it's gonna be a thing. When you do get down the line and everyone's done the work, and you still have an owner who won't, they kind of get into this process, and I think they have all this adrenaline going and all this stress, and they're like, well, let's do another one. Like, let's have another descope meeting. You're just like, no, man, like this is it. I think in this market, that's been more and more of a thing.
Yep.
It's just really kind of letting the owner know, particularly for CMs or for GCs that have done the work. You're like, no, man, like we've done everything we can. Like, this is really it. I think that's what sometimes owners get wrong, because I think they see that this descoping process does have the possibility of VE and, and we counted this thing wrong and we didn't take account for that thing. And they see that as the scope becomes tighter, the price does change. And they think that you can do that indefinitely. And it's like,
right.
No, like you get to a point where you're actually done. Like you're done.
Right. So with the supply chain issues and then when you have a GMP contract, what tension are you seeing between the supply chain issues and the GMP?
That's an interesting one, because I'm in the process right now of buying 2 jobs, or 3 jobs actually. And it's, I don't know. I've been calling a lot of BS, because we know where the challenges are, right? Like I know that if I'm going to buy Miele appliances, they have a 7-month lead time. I know that today.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, and if I order them today, I'm going to get them in 7 months.
Right.
So if I sign a GMP that has Amelia appliances, and then, 2 months from now, I hear from Ferguson or whoever ends up being, or if I buy them direct from Amelia, whatever, I hear from the CM that it turns out that they haven't put in the order, and that it's now 10 months because now they're at the bottom of the queue. And not only, so you're like even further away, right? Like you're 12 months from where you would have been originally.
Right.
That's BS. That's like, you didn't do your job on time.
Right.
That's not the supply chain. It's like, we knew 2 months ago that
Right.
these are the 7-month lead time. And the minute that we signed that piece of paper, you had to run out of that office and tell Ferguson to go ahead.
Yeah.
So, and that's where people like, you do the dance and like, you get it. And sometimes you miss things, but when you're missing like a $500,000 like appliance purchase, I don't know, like that doesn't seem like minor to me. Like, oh, you forgot to order your elevators? Okay, well, this is what your liquidated damages look like.
Yep. Yep.
And again, a little bit of that does go back to the owner, because
Right.
you should be having weekly meetings. And in those weekly meetings, particularly at the beginning of a project, you should be reviewing schedule. And what's the first thing that you do on a project? You buy things. And if every week you're not saying, hey, did you release Ferguson? Hey, did you buy the elevators? Then who's watching the job? Like, whose job is it? Right? So again, it's everyone holds a little bit of it, but to me, the minute that you sign a GMP, particularly now that a lot of the material suppliers are only giving you quotes that are good for like 2 weeks, like if you sign within that 2-week period, that PO better be released like 30 minutes later, because, right. You're like under the gun to be releasing subs as you get to your percentage at which you GMP. And, if everyone's rushing to get it done, but then you're not rushing to go ahead and sign those subcontracts or LOIs, then what the hell are we doing? Like,
yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So we've covered the owner's perspective. We've covered this idea of strong contracts, data and transparency, and how all those things work together. As we're wrapping up our conversation here, what would you say are 2 or 3 key pieces of advice that you as an owner's rep would give to a contractor in order to be successful working with the types of clients that you work with?
I think the first one, you need really good supers.
You
need supers that have all the trades on speed dial and that have good relationships with them. They need to be people that are able to get people to do for them.
Yes.
Because at one point or another, everyone, the guy got sick, didn't show up, the next guy comes, and now you're out of sequence. How do you solve for that? And so you got to have somebody who has the relationships and the quickness on their feet to solve that. So supers are, I think, some of the most important people. The next one is staff your projects appropriately. And I think that speaks to, again, obviously the supers, but in a more general idea of the whole project, where it's like, if you're running $100 million job, like you need to have somebody running that accounting very tightly. It can't be your project executive. It can't be your estimator. It can't be your super. It has to be someone that is able to take on that job and to do it well. And then finally, and it kind of builds on the 2 prior ones, is, you need to have up and down, particularly the executive on the job. You need to have a really good pulse on the project.
That's really great.
To the extent where if the owner calls you, you're not like 3 months behind on what's going on site.
Yep.
So I think that, and all of those things have all these built-in things, right? Like you need to keep super, super accurate, up-to-date schedules. That's kind of a basic, but yeah, the main 3 things, like your supers are the kings and queens. There's some really great women supers out there that I've worked with. Yep. Your staffing needs to be appropriate for the job.
Yep.
And you need to know what's happening on the project.
That's beautiful. That's just so, I really like it because, again, like we said earlier, construction is so incredibly complex, but the people side of it doesn't have to be if you've got your act together.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
That's interesting. Tell us a little bit more about you, Antonia. What is it that you do? How can we get a hold of you? All that kind of good stuff.
Yeah. So I'm a registered architect in a couple of states. I practiced architecture for some time, and then I went to work in-house for a big New York developer. We did really scary, really big work. We did large-scale repositioning of office space into luxury rentals. And that owner was sort of like the highest risk kind of profile for an owner. They were an owner GC. So we held the contracts directly, and that brought all kinds of challenges onto the job, but it was extremely rewarding, and they were able to complete work for incredible margin. So that was, I did that for a little while, and then I went to work for a big hotel owner operator nationally. I worked on TWA for them. I basically managed the renovation of the flight center. And then with that company, I led a team of people where we renovated a bunch of hotels across the country, a lot of them. We did about 78 renovations in 18 months. And then finally, I started MADDPROJECT actually in 2017, kind of doing side things here and there. But I think it was like early 2020, before the pandemic, I knew that there was going to be a shift. My family moved out to Utah. And so I was kind of getting ready to ramp up my shop, and then COVID hit. And then I ended up staying another year with that hospitality developer to sort of wind things down. Yep. But in the meantime, I got MADDPROJECT running. So we're basically an owner's rep. We manage projects from the beginning, from feasibility all the way down to construction. And at any moment through that process, we can help out on sort of like a standalone project basis. Like if you just need help negotiating a contract, or if you need help doing a full project audit, we do a lot of those. And I have a great team of people, and you can find me on Twitter. And I can, you can share. I don't know if you'll have some notes on.
Oh yeah. No, we'll have the Twitter handle in the show notes, and a link to your website, of course.
Yep. That's it. And that's the best way to get a hold of me, through the website. There's a form, or you can email me, or you can find me on Twitter. We're always responding to interested people.
That's beautiful. Well, I really, really appreciate your time, Antonia. This has been an extremely helpful conversation, and thanks for joining us on Construction Genius here today.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Eric. And this was awesome.
Well, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Construction Genius today. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Antonia. And before you jet off for the day, I'd like to direct you to my website, www.constructiongenius.com. And on the website, I have a resource that I think you'll find tremendously helpful. It's called Kick-Ass Meetings. You have to run meetings all the time in your construction business. You want to learn how to run them well so that you bring your team to an agreement on how to solve your toughest challenges, and Kick-Ass Meetings can teach you how to do that. So go to constructiongenius.com/kickassmeetings